Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Alterio from the Occupational Therapy Doctoral Program at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being willing to sit uh, with something that might be a little bit unconventional as it relates to uh, pedagogical methods for ethics. Um, Today, I want to talk about this topic. I think it sits at the intersection of ethics, storytelling, imagination, and also professional formation. And specifically, I want to talk about how speculative fiction can help us teach ethics in ways that might feel more meaningful, more human, and frankly, more honest, I think, than the ways we often try to teach ethics now. So, this presentation draws on my own work that was published in uh, an online project titled Occupational Punk Volume 3, part of a global health punk project. I encourage you to look that up. It's a creative movement and experiment and project that explores healthcare futures through fiction, narrative speculation, and narrative experimentation. But it also, draws upon real classroom experience. The kinds of experiences when you look at your students and you can feel that they want to think deeply about the topic that you're talking to them about, but they don't always feel free to. So that's where I hope to begin here. Um, Ethics education in OT and really in across all health professions often gets flattened down into something that I think is dry or too abstract or purely procedural. Students sometimes treat ethics like it's a multiple choice test. And so they'll say, well, what's the correct answer? Which of these rules applies? Or uh, what's going to get me in trouble. And in my thinking, when ethics becomes performative, it loses the part that matters most, and that's imagination. Moral imagination. That's really what we want our students to be engaging in. We want them to see the human story behind and beyond the ethical dilemma. We want them to understand the system underneath the suffering that might be happening. Um, and I think that OT historically is pretty good at helping us understand this. I think about Clark's work on narrative and some of that seminal narrative reasoning work done by Mattingly and Fleming. Um, I think that we are a profession that's rooted in stories, and those stories are meaningful. So um, we're rooted, though, in what I call a messy humanity of occupation. So the question I think should be, what kind of ethical pedagogy supports the formation of clinicians? Uh, who can reason in narrative ways and in relational ways and in emotionally complex ways. And that leads us to uh, the trouble that I was having in the classroom that led me to this project. So why speculative fiction? I think that our students today are experiencing and learning ethics in a really deeply politicized and often polarized, morally polarized climate. And it's not subtle. It's ambient. It's all around them. It's the air that they breathe. And students tell me, sometimes quietly, sometimes out loud, that they're actually afraid to talk about their viewpoints, or they're afraid to ask certain kinds of questions, um, or sometimes afraid to admit that they're uncertain, or that they're fearful of judgment from the instructor, from their peers. It's not that they lack curiosity. I think they have plenty of that. Um, And it's not that they're incapable of moral reasoning. I think that they're very capable of that. But I think that there's something about our current climate, our current environment, whether it's a social environment, or the digital environment that they play in regularly, um, the academic environment, that sometimes even we might be applying pressures or teach them that certain ideas might not be allowed, or at least not safe to express. We hear about these stories, and we all know the cultural climate of what's going on in terms of uh, how these kinds of uh, ideas are met with welcoming, and sometimes resistance. So I think what we see in students is hesitancy and self-censorship. Um, I think they over-index on what they think is supposed to be correct. Um, and they're fearful of saying the wrong thing. And I think that's catastrophic for ethics education. Because ethics requires heterodoxy, and that's the whole idea of speculative fiction, so that we can create a safe distance for ethical reflection, and that's really what the health punk model allows to happen. Um, so we have to build this safe container, or a safe location where moral exploration can happen really freely, without threat, without partisan or social or digital pressure, without the perception of punishment. We need a place where students can try on different ideas, discard them, reshape them, and not be penalized for that whole process. And I think that's where speculative fiction becomes very, very powerful, because fiction gives us distance. And that's important. It allows a conversation about society without saying, this is your society. Or it allows a discussion about justice without saying, this is a critique of your politics, right? So it's that distance. So I think that speculative fiction does the same thing in a lot of ways, that Aesop's fables accomplish for us. The fox and the crow can say things that humans are afraid to express directly, and the fable creates emotional safety and social safety. It's a symbolic world where you can morally play, and where heterodox thinking becomes more accessible. So speculative fiction, to me, is the modern day Aesop's fable. And I think it's really powerful and helpful for that. So students can ask, what is it that I'm thinking, instead of what am I allowed to say, or what is it that I'm supposed to be thinking? So that brings us into the world of health punk that I found online. Okay. So I found this group, international collaborative group, therapists, doctors, talking about using um, narrative, and particularly speculative fiction, to imagine futures, where uh, we where we might be able to explore ideas about possibilities, for health, for care, uh, for more broadly, I suppose, human flourishing. So it asks, what might healthcare look like in worlds that we haven't dared to imagine yet? Uh, that's the purpose of health punk. It's not supposed to be predictive, saying this is our future. It's supposed to serve more as a provocation for thinking, to get at some deeper emotional truth about the things that we encounter and that we struggle with, and perhaps give us an opportunity to engage in speculative critique, because then we can have an impact on the way we're looking at things today. So Occupational Punk series was one branch of the health punk narrative focused specifically on occupational therapy, disability futures, and the politics of lived human experience. And that's where my story got published in that Occupational Punk series. It's called, and the story is called The SoulCraft Rebellion. It was a post-pandemic dystopia that was governed by utilitarian equity, which hits at the core of justice questions. OTs in this were branded as human optimization engineers, and disabled lives were devalued. And therapists were making decisions based on resource metrics and controlled by surveillance. And the protagonist, Maya, who's a human optimization engineer, aka occupational therapist, uh, resisted this system, and that's what her story is about. Okay, so how do I use this in class? What I do is I usually start off with a reading, of the story, and then I start to talk to the students about um, uh, what are the ways that you feel, right? I don't want to ask them what ethical principles are at play or what ethical principles apply. I think that's often a standard methodology. So we'll say, here's a story or here's a situation, and which of these ethical principles apply? And it's very formulaic, and um, it doesn't spark moral exploration. So instead, I'll say, how did this story make you feel? And where in the story did you feel tension or discomfort? And why do you think you felt that way about it? So, or I'll ask, what kinds of assumptions did this fictionalized society push you to examine? And are there any parts in this story that, or aspects of it that you can recognize in our own world? And there we have the distance. So we've created the distance. We're not talking about anything real. We're talking about a fictional story. And I found that the room comes alive. The distance of fiction gives the student freedom, and perhaps a sense of safety so they can speak boldly and speak honestly, and their ethical imagination flips on. And then after I've gotten their ethical systems flipped on, then I can start to layer in things like procedural justice versus Rawlsian justice, or what are care ethics and what do they mean? What are virtue ethics and what does that mean? What is a capabilities approach? What is relational autonomy? And then suddenly we have this speculative, fictionalized world where we're safe to apply these concepts without judgment from our peers or the instructor about how someone might feel about something in real life. So the theory then of this pedagogy becomes a lens, and it's not a club, right? So the students aren't beat up by the methodology. So the pedagogy and the narrative illuminates moral reasoning, and there's no policing of student perspectives. So that's the pedagogy. It's driven toward judgment-free moral play, moral exploration, in a context where they're free to explore in ways that they might not otherwise feel so free to explore. So we read the story and it's paired with a reflection assignment. Um, uh, the student steps into the story, not as an observer, hopefully as a participant. And then with journaling and guided prompts, they examine their own emotional and ethical and professional reactions to what's going on. And then we integrate with those formal ethical frameworks and apply them, hopefully. So after we pair the ethics reflection with the story, then we're in a better position to critique Rawlsian equity, for example, via the story's outcomes. And as I said, looking at care ethics and virtue ethics, and looking at, what are the occupational therapy values around our own commitment to meaning and human dignity. And the speculative fiction just updates our traditional pedagogical tradition, I think, in a way that makes the content more accessible to the students. And it does it in a way that aligns with what Nash promoted in terms of describing a multimodal uh, pedagogy for teaching ethics. That it does improve student confidence and uh, safety. So health punk fiction is a tool for what I like to call radical ethical rehearsal. And I think that it harkens back and is supported by our own narrative tradition and the things that, we all subscribe to, I think, in terms of the work that was done by Clark and Mattingly in the early 90s. And it, it builds upon that idea of narrative clinical reasoning. So it's that ethical rehearsal, radical ethical rehearsal that I think is most important. And then hopefully, eventually, the students will then be able to bridge that content into real clinical encounters so that we're no longer in a situation of saying this is the right thing to do in this situation, but having them morally explore all the different possibilities of what might happen. Because as we know, these ethical dilemmas that we're all facing in practice every day are more gray than they are black and white. So, this methodology hopefully helps the students begin to identify themselves as ethical actors, and not really as ethical subjects who have to perform a certain way on our exams. Uh, so that's what I'm hoping this accomplishes. Um, as I said, what do I start to see? Um, High engagement. Students seem to enjoy the methodology, seem to enjoy the stories, seem to enjoy the frameworks that feel more safe. They appreciate that fictional distance and the emotional resonance with the stories. That's the tremendous thing we can do in fictional context is we can create these worlds and dynamics and systems that'll really get them thinking. Um, and it allows them, in particular, I found to help them explore some of our ethical concepts in ways that were a little bit more or too dry or too abstract. It's very difficult to engage students in a conversation about, please read these two perspectives, one on procedural justice, one on social justice, one on Rawlsian justice, and it's very dry and challenging to hit students with material and content that way. Um, so instead, we put them into the story and we allow them to experience it and develop their own professional identity formation around the way that they're exploring this. And I think that uh, it allows for a little bit more ethical pluralism. And I think that that's also an important feature that we should try to be promoting. So, what are the more broad implications? What does this mean for our field if we can train our students to think differently about their ethics? Um, I think that we can disrupt simplified frameworks. And I'm particularly interested in looking at how we're defining justice in our profession and how students are engaging those topics. I think that, you know, occupational therapy has always been a profession of stories, right? When I'm thinking about the broad implication for OT education here, um, we're a profession of stories. We are interpreters of lived experience, and we work in that gap between what is and what might be. That's what occupational therapy actually does. And I think that that's also the territory of fiction. When we read a good book, we know what is, but then we get immersed into the story and we think about what could be or what might be or what is in another context. Um, and that's important for us to do cognitively. And I think it's important for us to do when we're training our students. I think that we can um, reintroduce ethical ambiguity into professional formation without telling students you have to do it this way, you have to think that way, right? Because they already feel those pressures. Whether or not we even say it that way, that's the way that peer pressure and social pressure and digital pressure works on our students' thinking. I think that this also scales to other health professions rather easily, and I think that this can help restore a certain moral reasoning as core to occupational therapy, but it does it in a more safe way, or at least perceived as safe by the people who are engaging in it. Um, More broadly, SoulCraft, uh, when I wrote the story, began as a fictional trope, but it became a metaphor to me for some of the deepest work that we're doing, crafting meaning in a system that often devalues it. And that's something we have to talk to students about. Um, can OT reclaim dignity amid scarcity and surveillance, right? Our students and we as clinicians um, experience those things all the time, scarcity in resources, right? And surveillance. We think about our documentation systems. We're constantly under surveillance. Are we preparing rebels or regulators? And I'm not saying that we should be preparing students to go out and break all the rules that exist in the systems, but we need to create students who can engage in the process of ethical reasoning around the systems that exist, and then be able to act morally and reasonably and ethically within those constructs, and then also participate in the larger conversations. So what does our profession need to become? I think that if we improve our ethical pedagogy, then we can help promote this kind of different thinking um, with our students. So, what are some of the next things that we're doing? Coding frameworks. I'm looking at thematic, qualitative categories of moral imagination, professional identity, resistance, especially when students go out and see things that they may not feel comfortable with, right? As practitioners, we go out and see things we don't like every day in practice. So, I want to capture some of that a little bit more and explore the links between narrative analysis and fieldwork performance and see how students develop their thinking over time. When we introduce this way of thinking about moral and ethical problems, and hoping to publish some of these findings when I gather a little bit more data. Um, I think also, as I mentioned, it's scalable. I think that um, health professions all experience very similar kinds of issues. Occupational therapy doesn't experience, this kind of difficulty with ethics education alone on a hill. Um, PT, nursing, public health, medicine, yeah, everyone really has the same issues. So, I would love for us to develop a speculative case library where people can present different stories from different perspectives. How does the occupational therapist feel about this story? How does the physical therapist respond? How does the doctor respond? And then we can build a collaborative network for ethics innovation in the way that we might look at our health education. I want to be an advocate for fiction as a serious pedagogy in accreditation contexts. I think that we can use these ideas of speculative fiction to drive our best educational practice as it relates to ethics education. So that's what I'm interested in looking at next. So I'd like to leave you with some questions to think a little bit about. Perhaps think where could this kind of pedagogy um, and this idea of speculative fiction, where can it take root in your program? We talk about simulation experiences all the time. So how does this fit in, really? What stories and what simulation experiences, because that's what this is really. It's a fictional simulation. Um, what kind of stories do the students need? Our job is to cultivate ethical actors, not just rule followers, although we don't, like I said, we don't want them to break the rules, but we want to give our students worlds where moral ambiguity is safe to explore, because in fact, that's what they're going to experience when they're out practicing. I believe that speculative fiction is one of the most powerful and perhaps underused tools that we have uh, to to do this. So when students can imagine new worlds, they also imagine new possibilities for justice, for care, for what the meaning of human dignity is. I think that's really important. Um, so what stories do your students needs and need, and how can we nurture soulcraft in a system that in other contexts bombards them with compliance messages? If we want to be doctoral, if we want them to think in an advanced way, uh, how can this pedagogy be used? So, thank you very much for listening to this. I would love to hear your reactions and perhaps your stories. And I look forward to having more conversations about this. I've included a reference list for you, and I'd like to encourage you to take a look at the references. In particular, look at the HealthPunk project, which uh, is where I was able to publish that one story, SoulCraft Rebellion, but you'll find dozens of contributions from people all over the world who are looking at speculative fiction and looking at it as a pedagogy and as an important method for our own reflection, and that I think can also be applied for our students. So I'd like to encourage you to take a look at that. And I want to thank you again for spending the time with me today to have the chat. Thanks so much.